All right, can you hear me out there? Yes, okay. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to do something different. Rather than sit here and read a paper that ends with my conclusions, I'm going to leave the concluding to you. And the way I intend to do that is through using something called the case method. The case method is an approach to teaching that I use very frequently with my students in the Marine Corps School for Lieutenants called the Basic School out in Quantico, Virginia. And what it means for you is I'm going to put you in the role of somebody from history who has to solve a particular problem. And the problem that you're going to have solved today is one that historians face quite often, and that's resolving contradictions within sources. So you're going to play a military historian, and you're going to have to solve that problem. So I can talk about slides. So our tale begins in February 2009, February 23rd. And you are playing, again, a military historian. In fact, you're playing me, playing Mr. Damien OConnell. You are a senior at the University of Arizona, and you're studying military history. Next slide, please. And today's a pretty great day for you because you've just gotten a job with the Marine Corps University Foundation. You've joined the Case Method Project, right? So your job is to write these cases, these interactive exercises. Next slide, please. Now, your first assignment, next, is to write a case on the military career of this gentleman here, Private First Class Guy Gabaldon, United States Marine Corps. Now, you have never heard of Guy Gabaldon before. His exploits, his deeds, you have no idea. So your colleague, your boss, starts you off with a few sources. Next slide. And next, please. So he gives you several excerpts from Gabaldon's memoirs called Saipan Suicide Island, and a few articles. These include an obituary from the New York Times, Gabaldon died in 2006, and an article from the LA Daily Mirror. And here are the basic facts according to these sources that you take away about Gabaldon's life. Next. And this I will add is a highly condensed summary of his life. So Gabaldon's born in East Los Angeles, and he becomes very fascinated as a child with Japanese culture. He learns a slang or street version of Japanese, and he even moves in with a Japanese-American family for about 3 years. Next slide. He joins the Marine Corps. He's assigned to the 2nd Marine Regiment and is part of the invasion force of Saipan. Next. And when Gabaldon lands, he's with his unit, he digs in, and the next day, he sneaks off into enemy territory by himself. This is a private first class. This is very junior Marine. It's fairly unusual. Now he comes back with 2 Japanese prisoners. Next slide. This is his commanding officer at the time, Captain John Schwabe. How do you think Captain Schwabe felt about Gabaldon's actions? Sir, what do you think? Shocked. Absolutely. Do you think he was upset? He was, and he said to Gabaldon, if you ever do that again, I'll shoot you myself. Next slide. So Gabaldon goes out the next day and does it again, bringing back more prisoners. So at this point, Schwabe says, all right, I'm going to let you go. You're bringing back prisoners. This is a very rare thing. We've taken very few Japanese servicemen prisoner at this point in the war. So you're getting results. I'm going to let you keep doing this. That's exactly what Gabaldon does. So throughout the Battle of Saipan, he's going into the jungle, he's going to caves, and he's taking Japanese POWs. Next. He's also taking lots of civilians. I don't have firm figures for the civilian population at the time of the battle. I'm thinking it's about 15 or 16,000. This consists of Okinawans, Koreans, Chamorros, Carolinians. So he's bringing a lot of these folks in as well. Next. Now on 7 July, the Japanese they're on their last legs. The battle's not going very well for them. They've been pushed back to the northern end of the island. They decide to launch the largest bonsai attack, suicide attack in the war. And it's defeated. The next day, on 8 July, Gabaldon claims to have taken 800 prisoners at once. 800, by himself. civilians, and soldiers. And I'll refer to this throughout the rest of the case as the 800. Next. Now, apparently there are some witnesses on hand, and Lieutenant James Hyde from the Division Intelligence Section apparently saw Gabaldon do this. He said, "I was there when Guy brought in the 800 prisoners. Everyone in the regiment talked about it." Next. Now, Gabaldon himself, in his memoirs, claims to have taken, as he says, 1,500 Japs. Again, by himself. Next. For his actions, he receives the Silver Star and is officially credited with obtaining vital military information and aiding in the capture of over 1,000 enemy civilians and personnel. Now, Gabaldon takes part in the invasion of Tinian after the campaign on Saipan ends. He captures more prisoners there. He then goes back to Saipan and helps root out Japanese guerrillas until he's wounded and then sent home. Next. So he gets a Silver Star. That is then upgraded in 1960 to the Navy Cross. That same year, a movie about Gabaldon's exploits comes out called Hell to Eternity. Next. So those are the basic facts that we take away from these sources. Now, at this point, we could go in several directions with the Gabaldon story, but we're going to focus on one facet in particular, and that's the number of prisoners Gabaldon took, and then also the kinds, or the types. There are really two types of people he captured. You've got Japanese servicemen, soldiers and sailors, and Korean laborers, Koreans who were forced to work for the Japanese, and then civilians, who I mentioned earlier. So we're going to talk about how many Gabaldon took, and what sort of folks he brought in. So you've read your initial sources. A few days later, you run into this source here, East LA Marine. This is a documentary on Gabaldon, and it features lots of interviews from Gabaldon and Schwabe, his CEO. Now, most of what Gabaldon has to say, we've already seen before. There's too many new things concerning us here. Next. But Schwabe adds a few bits of information, useful information on our subject, the number of prisoners and types of prisoners Gabaldon took. He said, "I went out quite a few times with Guy. We go up to where there was a cave. We knew there were some Japanese in there, and usually there were civilians in there with them." And then finally, he's talking about the 800. "I was up on the observation post, and I see this trail of people that were coming along, and there were civilians and Japanese. You can't see it at the bottom of the screen, but there were 800. That was the best I could estimate." Next. So you've got these testimonials from folks who say they saw Gabaldon perform these feats, but you want to look at the official records. You want to look at, first, the official history. So you turn to this, History of the U.S. Marine Corps, Operations in World War II, Central Pacific Drive, and that covers the Marianas Campaign. And in the conclusion of that chapter, you see this. The total number of POWs held on Saipan as of 9 July stood at 736, counting 438 Koreans. But the post-campaign mopping up raised the total to 1,734 by 27 July, including 838 Koreans. Next. So, Mr. O'Connell, how do you reconcile these? Sir? How do you reconcile stories with that information?
Probably ask for a recount.
Say again?
Probably ask for a recount.
Okay. Ask for a recount, confirm it. Sir?
I think stories grow in time, and when you're overwhelmed at the moment, you overestimate. There was a lot of emotion going at the time, and a lot of awe. So, when I've met and talked, most of them were so I think we're civilians, is my impression.
Okay. Anything else? Anything else? Anybody else want to add to that? How do you reconcile this information? All right, well, what I decided to do is I want to gather more evidence. I want to find more things out. That's exactly what I did next. So I started contacting veterans of the campaign, guys who fought on Saipan. And one of them, Dodson Smith, who was from K Company, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, reaches out to me. And he says, "We had some caves. I had to call for Gabaldon 3 or 4 times. That was the only time I met him. He always did a good job of either talking Japs out or going in and killing them if they did not come out." It sounds like this is praiseworthy. He's saying Gabaldon did a good job. Next. Now from the same battalion, also 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, but from a different company, you run into this gentleman, David Dowkin. And he has these things to say. One of the last days of the campaign, I saw columns of civilians headed south along the road with clean Marines, headquarters people, as escorts. Were these the 800 people? He mentions that he thinks there's some truth to Gabaldan's history, and he ends on this note, not an entirely favorable note. Gabaldan is a type one finds in the military. He wanted to be a hero, and he was probably a courageous and very imaginative individual. And also typical of this type of character, he was a fabulist. The stories of single-handed capture, the killing of many, many Japanese are pure fable. He is not the only one in the military to have ever done this. So same battalion, very different opinions. Next. So we continue to gather our evidence, our documents. You're online one day and you're looking at the Modesto B online archives. And you find this article with this quote, saying the 73-year-old Gabaldan and his supporters say he set a record for imprisoning 1,800 Japanese soldiers on the island of Saipan. 1,800. Next. A few days later, again in the Modesto B online archives, you find another article, this one with lots of quotes from Gabaldan, from Schwabe, from other veterans of the campaign. Here's some of the things they have to say. Next. So Gabaldan says, I captured more Japanese by myself than 2 or 3 divisions combined. I'd go out and kill and capture Japanese every day, and I know I got 800 prisoners in one day. Next. Charles Mongus, who was with L Company, 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines, argues that Gabaldan talked out a lot of civilians. Next. And then Schwabe weighs in, saying that this is always the big bugaboo. How come there are no records? I can understand that, but nobody was going to spend time at a desk or hunched over in a foxhole working on records. Not too long after that, you get in touch with this gentleman, Bernard Rutchin, who served in E Company, 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, the same regiment as Gabaldan, and for a time, part of Gabaldan's unit. Gabaldan belonged to the Regimental Intelligence Section of the 2nd Marine Regiment. And these two gentlemen worked together. And Rutchin tells you this. One night he brought a guy in, that's all I can verify. The validity of Gabaldan's claims are doubtful. I think he's commingled the number of Japanese servicemen captured with civilians who were captured toward the end of the campaign. And then he ends with, the numbers are embellished, they're exaggerated. Next. Another gentleman you run into is Bill Crumpacker, who was with 1st Battalion, 8th Marines. And he claims that none of Gabaldan's claims were ever verified. He does think he brought in some children and other civilians, and maybe he did bring in some Japanese soldiers. Next, please. So, our job is, pretty crystal clear. We know exactly what happened, right? This isn't confusing at all. No, in fact, you're left feeling very confused. You have all these different accounts. You're not really sure what's the truth. So you decide to go to Quantico, Virginia, to visit the Marine Corps archives there and see if you can look at the source documents, right, the documents written after the Battle of Saipan to get at the truth. Next. So one of the things you look at are the daily dispatch summaries from the Northern Troops and Landing Force. This is the headquarters for the invasion force of Saipan. And you're looking at the period in particular from 6 July to 10 July, which covers the period in which Gabaldan captures his 800. So you look at a few days before and a few days after. Now I want you to take a look at the numbers and say civilians interned to date, and then below that, military personnel captured to date. So this is 6 to 7 July, 1800 to 1800, or 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. Next. 7 to 8 July. You notice there's a 905-person increase in civilians interned, a 27-person increase in military personnel. Next. 8 July to 9 July, 712 and 79. Next. And then finally 576 and 105. So numbers are certainly going up. Next. you're looking through these documents, if you find something that strikes your eye, this is an intelligence report and written after the battle, and it's got a chronology of events. And you notice on the bottom of one of these pages, which you can't see on the screen, that on 6 July, there was a curious report, and it said that at about 1800, 6 p.m., Marines serving with the 25th Marine Regiment start seeing lots of civilians heading towards them, about 100. And they start entering the Marine lines. They're looking for assignment. And then by the next day, at 11 a.m., 700 to 800 civilians have passed through the Marine lines. 700 to 800. Making things even easier on you, a few months after your visit to Quantico, you find an article from the Albuquerque Journal where Gabalin is quoted as saying, "I captured 2,000 fanatical, die-hard Japanese." Next. And one more. So, Mr. O'Connell, what conclusions can you draw about this?
Could there be a possibility of execution of Japanese soldiers?
Absolutely. That's one explanation. Sure. Mr. O'Connell, what conclusions can you draw?
Some people, large increase in people.
Okay, so prisoners were certainly taken. Okay. Would anyone else like to weigh in?
They're counting civilians as soldiers.
Okay, so everybody the Americans encountered are considered fighting men initially.
They're counting a lot of the civilians who want to give up as soldiers.
Okay, so clearly there are explanations for this. So next, my purpose. Oh, sure. Let's get someone else.
I think it's very important to separate Koreans and Japanese. Koreans came in on their own because they didn't like the Japanese. We had 3 cancer students, one from Japanese, one from Korean OConnells, and one from Children's. And there were 700 POW officially projects.
Sir, so are you saying that you think there's some confusion with the Japanese servicemen and the Korean laborers? Okay, so and we need to make sure to separate those out. Anyone else? Yep, sure. You go, sir.
Yeah, I actually wasn't familiar with the story about Mr. Gabalin, but it appears to me, in my opinion, the numbers aren't anything that's that critical. It just appears to me that the Marines allowed him to keep working, so it appears that what he was doing was something they thought was positive, and it sounded like he saved a lot of lives.
I would agree. So the reason I presented this information in this manner was one, it's fun. I get up, I'm able to interact with you. This is, again, something I use very regularly with my students in Quantico, Virginia, with the Marines. And second, I wanted to show you one of the very common problems that military historians face. So in today's day and age, we are drowning in a superabundance of sources of information, right? And oftentimes, these things, I'll come over to you in 1 second, sir. And oftentimes, these sources are contradictory. So one of the things that we have to do is try to reconcile. And this, I think, is a good exercise, a good example of that in action. Yes, sir.
I knew Guy for 16 years on site camp. You haven't mentioned Colonel Sheets at all. Colonel Sheets was here for the 50th. He spoke, Guy spoke. He corroborated Guy's story in person. And incidentally, in all the years that I knew Guy, he helped edit this book. Book of Honor, the KIAs, which were fitting for the Court of Honor if you go to the park. I didn't once ever hear Guy say I was a hero. Everyone that labeled him as a hero would get a comment, I am not the hero. The soldiers that we have at the Court of Honor were the So based on what I know about Guy and based on the numbers, and this is 5 years of research to find these KIAs, the numbers are difficult to corroborate.
Absolutely, sir, and you really set me up for my next slide. Next, please. So this is an ongoing research project, and I am always open to new evidence, to interviewing new folks. I've been working on this, as you know, for a little while, and I'm interested in anything you have to offer. Next, please.
Question?
Yes?
Can you tell us anything about his being nominated for a Congressional Medal of Honor and also some information about his possibility of being court-martialed right after being eliminated?
Should I handle that question now or at the Q&A? I'll handle it at the Q&A, and I can't answer that. So here's my information. If you have any questions, comments, curses, my email is at the bottom of the screen, and my phone number is there as well. Please contact me. I'm happy to take you up on any offers, any leads. Again, this is something I've been working on for a while, and I haven't quite made my mind up yet, but I'd like to get to the truth of things. And that's all I have for you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be invited here. I have been thinking about Saipan, talking about Saipan. My mother was a naval flight nurse during the war. I met my father in Hawaii, but her battle record took her to Saipan, Kwajalein, Inuitak, Iwo Jima, and then finally Okinawa. So some of the people we just heard about from Kathleen, it's possible even that one of the people in that group might have been flown by my mother back to Hawaii. So I want to thank you again for the opportunity to speak. And today I'm going to try to address the story of the Japanese on Saipan, particularly the story of the Japanese soldier. But let me just begin with sort of general overview history that we have quite clearly. Sorry, Mike. How close? Okay. I feel like I'm about to eat this giant microphone here. Thank you. I apologize for not being experienced with the mic. It has been said time and time again that, as we heard in the moving marks of our earlier speakers today, that Saipan was the battle that defined the character of the Pacific War. And in the course of nearly a month of bitter conflict in June and July 1944, U.S. and Army troops seized from Japan an island that Prime Minister Tojo Hideki had declared to be the bastion of the Pacific, a vital part of the defensive perimeter of Japan, which would protect Japan's homeland from attack from the United States. It was mentioned in one of our earlier speakers that, of course, from the U.S. side, it was exactly that purpose, to seize Saipan and make it possible to destroy the Japanese home islands by air, for which Saipan was picked out as a target. Contemplating the 16,525 U.S. casualties, including something like 3,426 killed and missing, suffered by the 67,451 men under his command. Howling Matt Smith, the Marine Corps general in command of the assault, that began, of course, as we all know here, on June 15th, 1944. He declared after the battle, and much into his later thoughts on the war, that the seizure of Saipan made Allied victory in the Pacific absolute. He said, "I have always considered Saipan the decisive battle of the Pacific offensive." And in a real sense, Saipan was not the fortified bastion that the Japanese High Command claimed. And I'm going to be talking briefly about this story from the Japanese side. But let me just begin with the High Command, who often get the credit or the blame for this conflict. I apologize for the rather feeble attempt to show Saipan to this audience. And we are familiar with the general maps of Saipan. And I will refer to this very generally. This is not a campaign history of the battle, but it is going to be an examination of some of the ideas that the Japanese experienced during that battle. I won't ask you to read the Japanese, but the Japanese study of the Battle of Saipan has been extensive. And we are all in debt to the tremendous number of Japanese scholars who have attempted to try to pin down issues that we'll be looking at briefly this morning. A number of people involved, a number of Japanese on the island, of course, is problematic. There were so many Japanese who had drifted in from sunken ships and lost battalions and units coming into the island. But there's been tremendous effort among Japanese scholars to try to pin down exactly how many Japanese military personnel, Army and Navy, were on the island. I'll refer to that briefly. But also, of course, is the issue of the number of people on Saipan categorized in our discussion as civilians. The commander of the theater, Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, of course, is known to all of us as students of the Second World War as the commander of the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the Battle of Midway and the defeat at Midway, Admiral Chuichi General Nagumo had hit the beach, and he had been a base commander back in Japan, but he was honored with the command in the Central Pacific, which was known to be the next attack area of the United States. But he was a man without a fleet. He was not in command of an active fleet, but was on the ground with a huge, extensive zone of operations stretching across the Central Pacific Ocean. It included the Marianas and Tinian and Saipan, of course, and the Bonins to the north, Iwo Jima. Although all the Army troops were theoretically also under the Central Pacific Fleet Command, the actual military command was under General Obata Hideyoshi. I wanted to show you this one picture of the last picture we know of Admiral Nagumo with his staff on Saipan right before the battle was joined. General Obata Hideyoshi was the commander of the Army, 31st Army, which was the Japanese Defense Force in this region. And General Obata his headquarters was on Guam, but he had the misfortune of being on Saipan Island the day the Americans landed. And so, but he was represented by his chief of staff, General Igata Keiji, who is going to figure prominently in my story as the man who was this representative of the Japanese Imperial High Command on Saipan Island. Again, I apologize to many of you who know the detailed history of this campaign, but it is important, I think, to get some sense that the Japanese had a very high level of command structure on top of this operation, and when we get down and look at the Japanese soldiers and the troops that were actually on the island to execute the so-called defense plan, we'll see very quickly that there was not much connection between the high command and the defenders of the island of Saipan. Major General Saito, Yoshitsugu's 43rd Division was the largest land formation, and General Saito had very little fighting power compared to what the books would say he actually had. One Japanese survivor of the battle, Yamauchi Takeo, who had the fortune of interviewing, who made this perilous voyage from Tokyo to Saipan with the 43rd Division, arrived with the first wave on May 19th, 1944. So just a little bit less than a month before the battle. Less than a month, and a substantial part of the men and equipment who followed the Tokyo were lost. So essentially, most of his division, the unit that he was with, were lost. 118th Regiment, for example, lost nearly 850 men during its voyage through the waters teeming with U.S. submarines. The naval story, of course, of this battle is critical. It's aside from my remarks, but the American Navy's iron ring around Saipan, and of course, what we're going to see is the huge battle, the Philippine Sea Battle, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as Americans have called it. But this tremendous Ago operation, the Operation was a catastrophe for the Japanese. But once you have an island that's undefended by a navy, you get the results we see in Saipan. Saipan was hardly ready to meet any invasion. The impression I had when I landed, said Yamauchi, was that they had made no preparations for defense at all. Along the coastline, there were only a few partially dug trenches, like earthworms laid out in the sand. I've noticed no concrete gun emplacements. I did hear some noise coming from high above in the mountains and was told they were constructing heavy artillery positions up there. Moreover, Squad Yamauchi led were all late call-ups, men 28 to 29 years old. For them, even marching was arduous. This is an important factor to recognize in the Imperial Japanese Army. By this point, the manpower situation was critical. And Japanese soldiers, as in fact I might even say had been the case in the invasion of the Philippines, all the Japanese soldiers were older than the men they were fighting against by a great margin, as you know, from the young Marines who landed here in Saipan. But these men in 28, 29 were not the top physical condition of the Army. And this meant that Yamauchi, who's observing this, is horrified to realize this is the people he's going to be struck with. But he's hoping that the Navy will win the battle that's coming. He knew it would be coming, and he wasn't terribly concerned at first. The total number of men was large. This is, of course, a serious problem when you have a large body of men somewhat disorganized with very limited resources to feed and house and clothe them. So even before the battle, the Japanese had a serious supply problem, which of course would become fatal, literally, in the course of the battle. The Japanese soldiers on the island of Saipan would, in large measure, equip themselves with the traditions of the Imperial Japanese Army. I'm not embracing completely the idea of dying for the emperor, willing to die for the emperor. I am embracing the concept that most Japanese soldiers recognized that they were in a very, very difficult position, that they were committed to the units they were with, that they had, like their American counterparts, had nowhere to go except back or stand where they were. So there's this real sense that the overwhelming American land power, sea power, and air power, which was unleashed against them, was unleashed against men who knew that there was, unless they were rescued by the Navy, there would be no escape. The precise number of civilians, including civilian settlers, natives, and military employees, is extremely difficult to calculate accurately. And I'm sure that those of you who've dealt with this issue in Saipan, many of you in Saipan, Tinian, and the whole Northern Marianas area, recognize that pinning down the exact number of personnel on the civilian side is extremely difficult. Again, partially because of the efforts to evacuate some civilians, which went awry, the pouring in of other civilians and labor forces that were not fully recorded. Meant that when the 5th and Superior Corps stormed ashore, they had the problem of things like the America Maru, which had been sent back with the first of 2 evacuation ships. The Japanese had thought to evacuate the civilian population, but 2 ships were lost and 500 men, women and children were lost. And on May 31st, both the Chiyo Maru and the Hakusan Maru sailed only to be sunk a few miles north of the islands. But let me continue the military action. The Battle for Saipan began with an air and naval bombardment that we know, extending over several days prior to the assault at dawn on 15th June. In fact, while the Americans were issuing withering fire on the beaches, and the story of the Saipan assault from the American side, of course, is a story of great struggle against great opposition. There's no doubt that it was horrifying and terrifying for the invaders to storm on a beach under shell from the enemy. But one has to realize that what a horror this was for the Japanese garrison as well. When the Japanese garrison could look up and see the American fleet appear one morning, like a great city that suddenly appeared offshore. By the end of D-Day, despite the difficulties of the new tracked landing craft and negotiating the beach, to the Japanese defenders, they seemed like a line of tanks. They looked like tanks. Of course, they didn't function like tanks to protect their crew, but the lessons learned from Tarawa and other earlier invasions had played an important role in creating a better vehicle to getting troops ashore, though, as we know, the American forces drifted a little bit off the target beach and landed on the beach. But as we heard this morning, what do you do when your objective sites and your objective landmarks have been eradicated by naval bombardment? It's not clear what you do next, and it took those Marines to move forward. On the night of the 16th, General Saito, commander of the garrison, ordered a night attack. an immediate repulse of the American forces at the beaches was his only prime defense plan. And the result was a miserable repulse. Japanese soldiers bursting from their spider holes, mowed down in the face of the concentrated American artillery, speaking traces and blazing lights. American forces kept coming ashore, and Japanese soldiers were engaged in a desperate battle for several more, but ultimately was a 3-week struggle to get leading up to what is going to become the famous final attack. And understanding the conditions on Saipan from the very beginning, almost from the beginning of the campaign, and from the beginning of the battle, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had been informed by General Igata, Chief of Staff of the 31st Army, on the real conditions on Saipan. He was going to be cabling on the 26th that even the conditions that prevail at that particular moment are catastrophic. And the whole campaign has gone astray. I'll go back for a couple. I've got several more, but I want to mention this, that for the Japanese High Command in Tokyo, almost the disaster of the naval operations in the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the loss of the Japanese carriers and forces of the Japanese ground air forces, Imperial Naval Air Force, essentially guaranteed that Saipan could not be retaken. But they didn't inform Saipan of this fact. Saipan was unaware, not fully aware at least, that the island has been abandoned almost immediately by Tokyo. You remember that General Tojo has declared this to be an unsinkable bastion, the key to the empire, and to admit that the key to the empire is about to be lost to the enemy, or has been lost to the enemy, is something which General Tojo and the High Command was not prepared to tell the Japanese people about. The result, of course, of this campaign will be that Tojo is going to be dismissed as Prime Minister and replaced after the battle. But as early as it's in the Imperial War Diary of June 23rd, excuse me for this, Imperial War Diary of June 23rd, the High Command in Tokyo simply stated, officers in Tokyo, it's not clear exactly who wrote this particular memo, but it's in the Imperial Japanese confidential diary for this date of June 23rd. In contrast to the strategic thought that was based on astounding advances in science each day and each month, defending an old and unchallenged castle and rejecting other advice and arrogance and self-masturbation and self-pride because errors like these have been continuous since the enemy landings in the middle of Solomon's in late June. Talking about Bougainville, I think, at that time. The Japanese High Command was aware that their whole defense strategy was a disaster. At least some officers were prepared to say that or write that out, but the nation was not going to be informed of this. Igate's cable of June 26, which is the one I've showed here, identified American control of the air and sea as decisive, rendering involvement by air by day impossible, while night attack using soldiers who have not, quote, night attack using soldiers who have not received good training means forces are lost, and simple of scattering of our forces. The reiteration of 2 night attacks by night means we have no forces left, essentially. He reported the conditions in great detail, so that's pretty much out of focus. I won't bore you with that. But he wrote back in his report, as if the real situation on Saipan Island, while shot at from our 4 directions, the enemy's artillery and bombardment strength is extremely large. I won't read the whole statement, but it's up there on the wall. Communications were aggressively made impossible by low-flying aircraft. Of course, American spotter planes spotted the Japanese concentrations and called in naval gunfire and artillery fire from the landed American troops. Igate reported a series of unique points for the Saipan battle, almost as if he was teaching them for the next lesson, having already given up on this particular battle, that the 11,000 defenders had arrived only late in May and early June as survivors of sunken ships. It's important again to remember that most of these people had not been on Saipan very long, most of the Japanese soldiers, or a large percentage of Japanese soldiers had not. And they were dragged from the sea completely disorganized. This is excuseless, with no clear chain of command. Second, inadequate water resources, destruction by the enemy of all known water sources, limited possibility of defense positions because they had to build their defense camps near natural water, swamps, pools of water, which were of course easily identifiable by the American air power, and of course also not congenial to health. With American attacks coming in all directions, he said, night and day, enormous volumes of steel falling continuously, we are under tremendous pressure with less than 20% of our fighting power. To sustain the northern area of Saipan and barely survive is impossible because of lack of water, men, and also civilians. He was aware of the problem of civilians, and there was something like at least 20,000 civilians on Saipan, and the Imperial Command had not integrated these 20,000 civilians into the defense plan except by calling for forced labor from among as many men as they could get to work for them. But that civilian population was a huge problem for Saito, who was going to, of course, come up with a solution for that. General Saito would come up with a solution for that problem, what he thought was a solution at the end of the battle. He gets to send a final radio telegram when the decision was made to launch what would become known as the final Banzai attack, the suicide attack on July 6th and 7th. The Japanese military had been divided into two groups, a small group in the south and a large group in the north. This was not fully acknowledged in the cables sent out by General Saito in their comments to the troops. But in General Headquarters, he reported right before this attack, the success or failure of the forces depend on commanding officers. Please pay great attention to the men above the rank of battalion commander. Before ending, I pray the prosperity of the Imperial forces and say Banzai to the Emperor. This is the last warning to the Imperial Army to come. We had a question this morning about the quality of the Japanese Army High Command, the nature of the Japanese officer corps, the professionally trained Japanese officers at the general staff level were highly intelligent, extremely well trained, highly selective, and proved in many, many cases completely incompetent at command of flexibility of command at the local level because of this command structure that forced them into situations where no matter how good they might have been as individual soldiers, the command failed. So the final Banzai charge, which is, as the Americans call this, came in the early morning of the hours of July 7th, 1944. It's taken on mythic proportions. According to the New York Times, describing the battle nearly a year after the fact, quote, Japanese poured through the gap in the line for the 27th Division like crowds swarming into a field like for a football game. Some were armed only with bayonets, lashed to bamboo spears and sticks. Some were unarmed, but all were screaming Banzai, Banzai, and 7 lives for the fatherland. The 1st Battalion Commander, William J. O'Brien, the famous story of Commander O'Brien, were reported to have held his position at the last, refused to retreat, and when last seen was standing upright, firing into the enemy ranks. This tremendous rush of Japanese overwhelming the American base camp that came through a gap about 500 yards wide, detected by Japanese scouts who were sent out from what looked like a beaten Japanese force the night before this attack. And they went through all the way to Tanaban village. One American Army major said it was like a movie stampede in the old Wild West movies. We were just the cameramen. Using the vernacular of the war, these Japs just kept coming and coming and didn't stop. I didn't make a difference if you shot one, 5 more would take its place. The Japs ran right over us. Again, that impression, this human storm experienced by the Americans in the early morning looked very different from the Japanese side. It's never been accurately determined how many Japanese actually took part in this charge, but it's likely that the number was about 3,000. Made up of ragtag units and remnants of the 43rd Division, all 3 regiments, field hospital and command units, all the headquarters units, and as well as some mountain artillery with no artillery, troops and supply men gathered and assorted naval personnel thrown into the last charge. Noda Mitsuharu, a naval enlisted man who had been on board, who had begun the war actually on Admiral Isoroku, Tojo Isoroku's flagship Nagato. He was in Nagato in the harbor in Tokyo when the reports of the Pearl Harbor attack came in. A bright young man. He was in charge of the Japanese cash, the pay cash for the entire Central Pacific area. He was sent to Saipan to be the paymaster for General Admiral Nagumo, and so he had a huge amount of cash with him and the pay books for everybody to make sure that people were paid. So he was a vital person sent to this area. Of course, there was no place to spend the money, and there was no opportunity to really send the money home either. But he found himself caught up in this attack. His version of the events was the following. Our last stand, it ends up in the last stand at Jigokudani, the Valley of Hell, as Japanese historians refer to this. Japanese veterans refer to this. Headquarters sent out its final message and then destroyed the radio. So that's so much for his pay duty. The telegram included the following lines from Admiral Nagumo. Whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there's only death. But realizing that in death there's life, let us take this call to assault on Japanese manhood. I shall advance upon the Americans to deliver this final blow and leave my bones upon Saipan. I just said it was from General Nagumo. Actually, it was sent out by Nagumo's headquarters, but it was actually the command of General Saito's last command. And the American attack at this time is in I know other. You see that white, the so-called Jap Banzai attack in the northwest, Market Point, and the Banzai Cliff is to the north, and then the south is another area of Japanese concentrations. Tokyo Defense, when they heard about this original attack, it said, well before Saito decided that there was no alternative to what they called Gyokusai. The Saipan Defense Force should carry out Gyokusai. It's not possible to conduct the hoped-for direction of the battle. The only thing left is to wait for the enemy to abandon their will to fight because of the Gyokusai of the 100 million. The Gauls guessed with 100 million on it. That's the entire population of the Japanese nation. And at this moment, there's a declaration to the entire Japanese people, essentially, that this is what fate will await you. This is the opportunity you have to serve your emperor. We're going to hear more about that in the session after this one. But the last days of the Battle of Saipan, of course, are about 20 members of the headquarters battalion that I mentioned before, the headquarters unit, took part in that battle for this suicide attack, rather. They had one bottle of Suntory whiskey, a Suntory square bottle, one left, someone had saved it. They all drank that, and polished it off among the 20 of them, and they smoked their last tobacco, Hikari brand, they'd saved the best for last. And according to the first person, we were even able to smile. Maybe we were still together as a group. I even had the feelings of superiority, for we were going to do something we had to do. On July 7th at 4 a.m., we started. Together we headed toward the enemy camp. Navy men were along the seaside. We may have advanced 500 meters. We were not going to attack enemies. We were ordered to go there to be killed. Some probably might have even gone completely drunk, just to overcome fear. But this was that last taste of Suntory whiskey. That last taste was wonderful. It was a kind of suicide mission. It wasn't an attack. We didn't crawl on the ground. The bullets were coming towards us. We advanced standing up. These men had all lain on the ground when the Americans landed on that first night and tried to get away. When Saito ordered the attack, most of the men were crawling the other way that first night and not charging into the battle. Now there was no point, and they had almost no water. If you think of the weather today, how extraordinarily hot, uncomfortable it must have been. A beautiful full moon last night reminded me of the romance that's been attached to this kind of suicide attack by night throughout Japanese literature, going back to ancient times, but certainly in the Second World War, over and over again, this occurs. We had hardly any arms. We had only shovels. Most had only shovels. Some had sticks. I had bullets in my stomach. I was hit by machine gun fire, 2 bullets in my stomach, one passing through, one lodging in me. I didn't suffer pain, none at all. my shoes just became heavy. I couldn't go to my feet. I tried to remove them, but my arms couldn't reach my feet. I saw an American soldier lying next to me, a knife at his belt, but I drew that, but still I couldn't reach my shoes. I took a stick from my hand to a dead Japanese soldier and tried the knife to strip off the cloth. I didn't know how many hours it took. Eventually I was able to cut my shoelaces, but I still couldn't rise. My trousers weighed so much they pulled me down. That's it, I thought. Then I saw a group of 4 or 5 men, Japanese, crawling towards each other on their hands and knees. Their heads were now all close together. One of them had a hand grenade. He held it upward in his right hand and called out an invitation to me. Hey sailor, won't you come with us? I said, I have my own hand grenade, please go ahead. I don't think the humor was there at the time, but in telling the story, the horror and the humor was there. I heard "Long live the Emperor" and the explosion of a hand grenade at the same instant. Several men were blown away, dismembered into bits of flesh. I had my death at an appalling sight. Their heads were all cracked open and smoke was coming out. It was a horrible way to die. Post-war figures for Japanese casualties on Saipan vary considerably. American sources speak of identifying 23,811 buried enemy dead, 1,780 captured, including 838 Koreans. We saw similar numbers, with some 14,560 civilians taken into custody. One Japanese source claims that 41,244 out of a total of 43,682 defenders from all units, Army and Navy combined. The problem here, and all the statistics here, is that the Japanese Army and Navy don't mesh the figures well together. They have separate histories in many, many cases. And so the result is you have to add them together yourself to get the numbers. We heard talk problem about that sources earlier. Is in such as this terrific casualties between 15 July and 15 June and 15 July 1944, these number of soldiers died in the battle. The one point I wanted to make before we go is that excuse me, I beg your pardon. I got the call here. The question of what was this Gyokusai concept? What was this Gyokusai that the Japanese were supposed to commit? The idea of Gyokusai as smashing the jewels, fighting to the death, dying in command. General Saito and the Japanese headquarters ordered said this should be applied to the civilians as well. Civilians too should not live after the battle, not allow themselves to be captured, and issued instructions to the civilians to live that way, or to die that way. Professor Haruko Tayakook will expand on this, on how this served in her paper later this morning, and will share the meaning of Gyokusai. But the term Gyokusai has become to mean sort of national suicide attack. It has a much deeper and more horrific meaning in the story of the Japanese war, and we will touch on that later on today. So thank you very much for your help.